Hey everybody, General Scar here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make cliffs like this. Let me just set these stupid options up here. Cliffs like this in Houdini. This is using Houdini Apprentice. This is the free version of Houdini. It's using 17.5.425, but you should be able to do this in older versions. There's not like anything cutting edge that's being used for this, but this is a very simple cliff sort of generator. We've got a few options. We've got an option to turn on high and low poly so that we can check the shapes and everything before we bake it into high poly, so we can just like lay out how it looks really quickly. And we've got an input as a sort of a shape. Right now I've got a way to take a curve and it'll just sort of like it'll sweep a line along the curve to determine where the cliffs go, and I'll show you how to do that later. And there's like a few different ways that we can input stuff. There's also a seed options. We can change the seed of how everything is working together. So let's just get into it. We're going to create a new project here. So new file, not save this one. I've already got it saved. And we're going to start off by setting up the shape more or less of the cliffs, the individual cliffs themselves. So it's basically made up of a bunch of tubes that we're going to VDB together and then put some mountain stuff on just to get some details. So let's just get started with that. So we'll just put down, if I can type, just put down a tube, and we're going to change this. Oh, right, we need to go into a geometry, whatever. So we put down a tube, change this from primitive to polygon, and we're going to make this sit on the ground here. So we're just going to copy our height, copy parameter, paste it into our center, and multiply it by half. So now it's on the ground. We're going to change our height to 10 and our radius scale to 3, and we're going to reduce our columns down to 6 just so it's a bit more chunky instead of tube-like. We're also going to increase the amount of columns we have by a little bit, and we're going to turn on end caps so we have a solid shape. And then we're going to put it through a point jitter just to give it a bit more shape, I suppose. We'll turn down the scale a little bit so it's not super jaggedy, just so it's a little bit more interesting. And so now we're going to be copy pasting it to points. We're going to be using a for each loop for this. We're not going to be using, it's going to be a little bit backwards, it may seem, but it'll make sense in a minute. So we're just going to put down a for each point loop, and let's get our points right now. So we'll put down a grid, and we'll put this through a scatter node so we can just get a bunch of points along the grid. We're going to use our density attribute and use 2D area for volume since we're using a 2D plane, and we'll just make this really kind of small, like 0.15, and stick this into our for each loop. So for each one of these points that's being created, and we'll plug in our different shapes here at the end when we want to draw our shapes for our cliffs and things like that. And we'll put in a copy point, and we need to make sure that this is plugged into the right one for the points. I think that's one on the right. Yeah, points to copy to, and then our geometry on the right. So right now this is just doing the same thing as a normal copy to points. Let's make our grid a little bit bigger. Oh, that's way too big. 2020, and change our scatter down to like 0.1 or something. Still pretty dense. But why we're doing it this way is so that we can have, we can use this to drive random values for the things that we're putting in based on the iteration of the for loop. So every time that it goes through a for loop, it'll get a random value and assign it to the different parts of the cliff, so it'll be more randomness. It won't be this uniform. So in the top of our for each loop, we're going to create a meta import node, and this is going to let us get the iteration value, which will be used to drive our random stuff. So we're going to add a null node here. We'll call this our seed ref, because this is where we're going to have our random values stored. So we're going to create, going to right click parameters and channels, edit parameter interface, and we'll add 2 floats here. We'll use the second one later, but for right now, we'll call this, well, we'll use the second one now anyway. This will be our seed, more or less. So we'll call this seed, and then we're going to call this one seed mod, and this will let us change our seed. So in our seed, we're going to want to get the data, we're going to get a random value based on the current iteration of the for loop. So we want to write out, if we want rand, we'll do a rand, and then we need to get the iteration, which is a detail, so we'll use a detail. And then in quotes, we'll get the name of the for each metadata node, and then we'll get the name of the information we want, which is iteration, and then we have to put a 0 at the end just because. And so then that, if we can reference this seed with like a right-click copy parameter and just paste this wherever we want without having to type this out every time we want to get a random value now. So it's just a really easy way to get a simple reference to the random number based on the current iteration, so we can change stuff really quickly. And we'll also copy the parameter for the seed mod and just add this at the end here right before the last, oh, whoops, not paste. You need to make sure you right click, paste relative reference right before the last parentheses. So then we can change the seed mod, and then it'll also change the seed value itself, so we can, change our seed later. So based on this, we're going to copy our parameter for our seed and go over to our tube. And since the rand returns a value between 0 and 1, if we just multiply it by our new seed, we get a bunch of heights between 0 and 1 now. Super simple. And we can do the same thing with our radius. And so obviously we don't want stuff between 0 and 1 all the time, because then it gets super tiny sometimes, which we don't really want. So we're just going to put this in a fit function as well. So we'll put in our number, we'll put in our min-max values of our input number, and the values that we want to fit between. So we'll just have this go from 0 to 0.5 as the minimum value. And we'll just put that in both, and then we get a bit more of a better distribution. There's not super tiny things anymore. So now we're going to change the shape of this a little bit more by booleaning it with another tube that we're going to randomize a little bit. So we're going to, instead of using a tube, we're actually going to be using a circle, so we can poly extrude it and do a couple extra things to the shape to make it a little bit more interesting. So we're going to start with a circle. We're going to change this to a polygon and change its orientation to ZX plane. We're going to reverse it so the normals are facing up, because that's just something you got to do. And we're going to add a poly extrude here, and then we're going to put a boolean, and we're just going to stick these two in there. So now we're going to drive some of these attributes. So we'll copy our radius scale and we'll paste it to our uniform scale here for the circle. So now the circle is the same radius as the tube, and we'll also take our height and put it in our distance for our poly extrude. So now the height is the same, and we're going to increase the divisions just a little bit here. We'll also put in a point jitter at the end of this to make it a bit more random, but we're also going to add a few things. We're going to add some inset, so it'll just sort of taper in at the top, and let's just add a bit of twist, why not? And we can drive these with our random seeds. One important thing in the poly extrude, we need to output the back so we get the bottom face so that we can actually boolean them properly. Another thing we'll want to do with this is add a transform right here, and we're going to rotate it based on the seed. So copy parameter, just so we get a little bit more variation in how it's cutting stuff up. So in our rotate, we'll paste our relative reference, and since this is between 0 and 1, we'll multiply it by 360 to get a value between 0 and 360. So now if we plug this boolean into our copy to points, you can see that all of our shapes, more or less, are working. In our circle, we also want to change this down to 6. That should help with our cliffs. Yeah, we just needed to make sure that there weren't so many tube shapes going on. So in our circle it was 12, and now we changed it to 6. Okay, so now that's basically our low poly shape that we can use, and so we can change, of course, the shape of like the grid, and we can increase, change our the shape we get. So now we're going to go into the high poly version of it. Let's organize this a little bit more. So now we have more or less our high poly, or our low poly, so we'll work on doing our high poly, and we're going to go with some VDBs to do this. So if we do VDB from polygons, and we just go inside, you can see we get our VDBs, and then we're going to do a VDB smooth SDF, not the normal one. Smooth SDF. And we're just going to leave this at default values. This is more or less just to round out some of the edges so we don't get such sharp, sharp edges. I just bumped up to 5. So and then we're going to go back to polygons. So we're going to do a convert VDB and change this from volume to polygons, and we get our polygons, which is great. And from here, we're going to add a mountain node, and we're just going to do a little bit of shapes just to get a bit, make it not so perfectly smooth and all that. Let's increase our scatter density just a bit, just so we don't get so many holes. And we're going to now take the normals from the geometry from the VDB and put them onto these, which might seem a little bit backwards, but I'll explain in a minute. So we'll just put down a normal node, and we're going to use points, and another normal node with points, and we're going to do an attribute transfer. So if you just type in transfer, it's the first thing that comes up. I find that easier to type than attribute transfer. Oops, let's move this over here. So we're going to take the normals from the original geometry and put them onto the new geometry, and these are going to be on the points. So now it's all smoothed out. We still have the shapes, but the normals are smoothed out, so we can put down another mountain node, and this is the one that's going to give us the lines. So we're going to change our scale to like 0.1, and you can see we get our lines, and we're going to change our element size to increase it, so we get some line stuff. And if we had not done the attribute transfer, there's like a lot of places where some of the normals, some of the geometry is clipping through each other because of their normals. So just like smoothing it out helps to avoid that a little bit. So in our noise, we're going to change this to flow, because I just like the way that it looks a little bit better. Let's increase our scale to like 3 and 3. Reduce this value just a little bit. And then if we come down and we scroll down to, let's reduce this a little bit as well. It seems to just smooth it out a little bit. So at the bottom of the mountain, there's this post-processing section as well, which is really useful. So we can change some stuff with this, complement, bias, and clipping. So clipping can just sort of, you can use this to min-max the values of the mountain more or less. And so we're going to be using a combination of the complement, the clipping, and the bias to make just some of the lines show up and not all of them. So, it's a bit more varied and a little more interesting. So just something like that. We can increase the more, and we can increase or decrease our height if we want. But so we get some very, nice little lines across the cliffs and everything. So that's more or less the high poly stuff. We're just going to add a little bit of cleanup here. So we're going to do a transform node, and we're going to move this down by 1. And then we're going to clip the bottom off of it just so we get rid of those geometry that we don't need. And we get, just a nice flat ground that we can stick stuff into with it. So let's turn this into digital assets. So we're going to select all of this, and we're going to create, or at least we're going to turn it into a subnet. Put it into a subnet folder, and we're going to double click this. We'll copy this, we'll cut this grid shape, and instead we'll drag our input 1 into the scatter. So then we'll paste this and put it there. So now we just have to put our shape that we want the cliffs to sort of form into this first input, instead of having to do it in the subnet. So we can change that out really quickly. One other thing we'll do really fast in here is add a switch node. So we can switch between the high and low poly versions. So we'll just add a switch, drag in our low poly first, and then our high poly, and then plug those into the transform. And we'll just call this low high switch. Okay. And then if we right click our subnet, parameters and channels, edit parameter interface, we can put in a float. This will be for our seed. And then we'll also put in a toggle. And we'll call this low high. Label it high poly so that when it's checked, it's doing the high poly. And so we'll copy that and paste it into our switch. So now if we click in this on and off, we can go between high and low poly. And for our seed value, we'll just come over to our seed ref here and copy the parameter for our seed. Or actually, we want to copy this and paste it into our seed mod. So now if we change the seed value here, it'll change the cliffs. So now we can change the input for the shape. So we can either do that with a curve, and we can just like draw a curve. Make sure that it's closed. We'll turn this into a NURBS, plug that in. And so this is something that I've noticed that I didn't have this problem like a little bit ago, but I've started having this problem. When I put a NURBS into a scatter, it only scatters along the outside edge of the shape for some reason. So we can fix that just by putting a resample in front of the scatter. And then we'll just increase this to like 1, so it doesn't have as many edges to it. But then that should fix, that'll fix that. Oh, and we should also put an output node here so that we get that as our output. So there's our shape, and we can change the shape. You know, if we change the shape, then it'll change where the cliffs go, which is cool. You could also probably have something for density. We can also do, let's put down a curve. We'll need a curve, we'll need a sweep, we'll need a line, and a resample. So if we put the curve into the resample, first let's draw out the curve. Something like that, and we'll make it a NURBS. Let's put it on a breakpoint so it goes through all that stuff. And we resample, we'll just resample to 1 for its length so that we just get nice evenly spread out points. And we'll plug this into the sweep for the backbone, and then the line into the cross section. And with the line, we're going to make it face in X, and we're going to copy the length and paste it into the origin, make it negative and multiply it by 0.5. That way when we increase the length, it just sort of, it's the same length on either side of the line. And then in our sweep node, if we do output skin with auto closure, or even skin unclosed in this case, I just usually do auto closure, we get a nice solid polygon, which we can stick into our cliff generator, and we get cliffs populating around it. And the cool thing is, if you have the length of the line is fairly small, in this case, let's see if we can even see it. Oh, we want the sweep. The width of the line is fairly small, so sometimes there's going to be sections that, you know, cliffs aren't populating in, which is actually kind of cool. And you could just increase the, you know, the thickness of the line to get, you know, more cliffs there. And you can always change the curves as well. So we can just move them, and it'll even work like going up and down. Although the clip won't, because that's, you know, on the base, but, you know, we can get the cliffs to go up and down and stuff like that. And we go to high poly, and then we just get all the cliffs nice and high poly. It only takes a few seconds for something like this. So that is how you can make some nice looking cliffs. Looks like some lines and stuff like that, some canyon cliffs in Houdini. I hope you learned something. Thank you for watching.